You think you know survival? The words cut through the air, sharp as a knife. Come with me, and I'll show you what real survival looks like. Jack Miller, an old man with weathered skin and eyes that had seen more battles than any of the kids in the neighborhood could ever imagine, stood at the edge of the yard, watching the group of kids in front of him. They were laughing, playing games, and joking around, completely unaware of the world beyond their little bubble. They had no idea that out there, beyond their screens and their safe, comfortable lives, survival wasn't a game. Jack had lived through it, had fought through it, and now, he was about to show them what it meant to truly survive. The kids, barely glancing at him, rolled their eyes. "What can an old man like you teach us about survival?" one of them, Ben, sneered. Jack just smiled, a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He had dealt with the arrogance of youth before, but he wasn't here to argue. He was here to teach. "I can show you how to make a fire without matches," Jack said calmly, his voice carrying across the yard. "How to find food when the store shelves are empty. How to survive when there's no one around to help you." The kids exchanged doubtful looks, but their curiosity began to grow. Ben, the leader of the group, challenged him with a smirk. "All right, old man, show us what you've got. Make a fire, then. Let's see if you can teach us something." Jack didn't say a word. He simply reached into his worn jacket pocket, pulled out a small bundle of twigs, and began to set them down in a pile. The kids watched in silence, their eyes narrowed with skepticism. Jack struck his flint, and within moments, a small flame flickered to life, casting a warm glow against the fading daylight. The kids gasped, unsure of what they had just witnessed. "That's just luck," Ben scoffed, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Jack didn't respond. He simply watched them as they stood there, speechless. "Survival isn't about luck," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about knowing what to do when everything goes wrong. When you have nothing left but your wits and the tools you've learned to use." The kids were no longer laughing. They were no longer mocking. They were listening. Jack continued, teaching them how to build a shelter with only the materials found in their backyard, how to purify water using simple methods. As he worked, he shared stories from his past, from the days when survival wasn't just a skill, but a necessity. He told them about the nights he had spent in the wild, the dangers he had faced, and the things he had learned that kept him alive. Slowly, the kids began to understand. They didn't just see an old man anymore. They saw someone who had lived through hardships they couldn't begin to imagine. By the time the sun had set, the kids had learned more than they ever thought they would. They had learned respect for the old man who had been through it all, who had shown them that survival wasn't about gadgets or games, it was about knowing how to live when everything else falls apart. As they left, Ben turned to Jack, his attitude completely changed. "Thanks, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice sincere. Jack just nodded, a small, knowing smile on his lips. "You'll be all right, kid," he said quietly. "Just remember, survival isn't a game." The next day, the kids returned to the yard, eager to see what else the old man could teach them. Ben, still skeptical but curious, was the first to arrive. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching as Jack moved around the yard, preparing for another lesson. "So, what's next, old man?" Ben asked, a little more respectful than before. Jack looked over his shoulder, his eyes sharp, but there was a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're going to learn how to make a shelter that will actually keep you alive in the wild," Jack replied, his voice calm but firm. "Not one of those fancy tents you see on TV, but something real. Something that works when there's no other option." The other kids arrived, slowly gathering around Jack. They were still unsure, but the doubt in their eyes had faded, replaced by something else, interest. Jack began by showing them how to find the right materials. He pointed to the large oak tree in the corner of the yard. "You see that tree? The bark there? That's your best friend in the wild," he said, walking toward the tree. "It can be used for so many things, shelter, kindling, even to make a rope if you know what you're doing." As he demonstrated, the kids started to take notes, watching every move he made. Jack was methodical, showing them how to strip the bark without damaging the tree, how to twist it into a rope, how to use it to tie things together. It's not about having the best gear, he explained, it's about using what you have. If you know how to use your surroundings, you'll never be unprepared. The kids were beginning to understand. They saw that Jack wasn't just teaching them survival skills, he was showing them how to think for themselves, how to rely on their instincts and knowledge. Ben, still a little unsure, hesitated but then raised his hand. What if it's raining, though? How do you stay dry? He asked. Jack looked at him, his eyes steady. Good question, he said. He led them to a pile of fallen branches and began to build a small frame. You always need to make sure your shelter is waterproof, Jack continued, but you also need to think about insulation. You can't just rely on the ground to keep you warm. The kids gathered around, trying to copy his movements, struggling at first but slowly getting the hang of it. Jack's patience was endless, guiding their hands, showing them step by step. By the time the shelter started to take shape, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the yard. Jack stepped back, looking at the shelter with satisfaction. Not bad for a first try, he said. The kids stood back, admiring their work. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. And they had built it themselves. Ben looked at Jack, a new respect in his eyes. I never thought we could do something like this, he said quietly. Jack nodded. That's the point, he said, you're capable of more than you think. The world doesn't wait for you to be ready, it's up to you to be prepared. The kids stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. They had come here thinking they knew what survival was. They had thought it was all about gadgets and tools. But now they understood, survival wasn't about what you had, it was about what you could do with what you were given. They were no longer the kids who laughed at the old man in the yard. They were learners now, ready to take on whatever the world threw their way. And Jack Miller, the old veteran, had given them the tools to do it. The following weekend, the kids came back, more eager than ever. They had spent the week practicing what Jack had taught them, and now, they were ready for something more challenging. Ben, the leader, approached Jack first, his eyes full of determination. All right, old man, we're ready for the next lesson, he said, his tone much more respectful than it had been just a week ago. Jack smiled, seeing the change in the boy. Good. Let's see if you're ready, he replied, his voice steady as always. This time, Jack didn't just stand in front of the kids, giving them instructions. He walked them down to the edge of the woods behind the yard, where the trees stood tall and the ground was covered in a thick blanket of leaves. We're going to learn how to navigate, Jack said, looking back at them. In the wild, you won't have a GPS. You'll have to rely on your senses, your instincts, and your knowledge of the environment. The kids followed him, their footsteps crunching the dry leaves beneath them. They didn't speak, each one absorbing the weight of Jack's words. They were far from home now, deeper into the woods than they had ever been. Jack stopped at a large oak tree, its bark rough against his weathered hands. This is your first marker, he said, pointing at the tree. You always need to find landmarks. In the wild, it's easy to get lost if you're not paying attention. He motioned for the kids to look around. See the way the branches twist and turn? That's something you can use to guide you. It's part of the landscape. The land tells a story, if you know how to read it. Ben squinted at the tree. So, we're just supposed to follow the trees and hope we find our way back. Jack shook his head. It's more than that. You need to learn to trust your surroundings. The sun, the way the wind blows, the moss on the trees. Everything is connected. Once you start seeing the patterns, you won't get lost. Jack led them deeper into the forest, showing them how to use the sun to determine directions, how to spot animal tracks, and how to find water by following certain plants. It's not always obvious, Jack explained, crouching down next to a small stream. But if you pay attention, the land will always provide. The kids watched closely, trying to keep up with Jack's pace, learning quickly. They had been taught to rely on gadgets, on technology, but this was different. This was about real survival, about understanding the world around them, not just using it. After several hours of walking and learning, Jack stopped. He turned to the kids, who were breathing heavily, their eyes wide with new knowledge. "All right, now it's time for you to prove what you've learned," Jack said. He gave them each a compass. "I want you to navigate back to the starting point. No maps, no phones. Just the skills I've taught you." Ben looked at the others, his jaw clenched. "You heard the man," he said, stepping forward. "Let's do this." The kids scattered, each trying to remember what Jack had shown them. Ben was the first to reach the starting point, his chest heaving as he looked back at the others. "I did it," he said, a grin spreading across his face. One by one, the other kids arrived, all of them exhausted but proud of what they had accomplished. Jack nodded in approval. "Well done. You've learned how to survive out here. Not because you had the right tools, but because you understood the land and your place in it." The kids stood there, taking in the lesson. They had started this journey thinking survival was just about physical strength or quick thinking. But now they knew it was about something deeper: connection, awareness, and respect for the world around them. Ben looked at Jack, his respect now clear in his eyes. "Thanks, Mr. Miller. We wouldn't have made it without you." Jack simply nodded. "You made it because you learned to trust yourselves. Remember that. And don't forget, survival is about knowing your limits and knowing when to ask for help." It had been weeks since the kids had first started learning from Jack Miller, and their understanding of survival had grown deeper. They were no longer the same kids who had laughed at the idea of learning from an old man. Now, they approached each lesson with respect, eager to absorb everything Jack had to offer. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the yard, Jack called them together for something new. "Today, you're going to learn what it takes to stay calm when things fall apart," Jack said, his voice steady, the usual weight of experience in his words. The kids, now accustomed to his way of teaching, gathered around, ready for whatever challenge Jack had prepared. Jack looked each of them in the eyes, his gaze piercing. "Out here, in the wild, things will never go as planned. You need to learn how to adapt, how to stay calm when you can't predict what's going to happen next." Ben stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "But how do you stay calm? I mean, what if everything starts going wrong?" Jack gave a slow nod, then pointed to the distant woods. "It's about being prepared, yes. But it's also about learning to control yourself when you feel like the world is falling apart around you. In situations like that, panic will be your worst enemy. Control is everything." He motioned for them to follow him as he led them into the woods. It was a different part of the forest this time, more dense and unfamiliar to the kids. The path was narrow, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and moss. "You're going to make it through here," Jack said, "but you have to trust yourselves and your instincts. Focus on your breathing, stay present, and don't let the little things throw you off." The kids, despite their growing confidence, were still nervous. They had never been this deep into the woods, and the shadows of the trees made the place feel almost eerie. Jack handed each of them a small pack with basic supplies. "We'll work together, but this is a test. You'll need to figure out the best route, find water, and make it back here before dark. But there's one rule: no talking. Stay focused." The challenge had begun, and the kids set off in different directions, each trying to navigate through the dense forest. Ben, who had been the most eager, led the way, keeping his mind focused on what Jack had taught him. He was determined to prove to himself that he could do this. As the minutes turned into an hour, the kids faced small setbacks, branches in the way, the occasional slip on the uneven ground, and the frustration of not being able to find the water source they were supposed to locate. Each challenge seemed small on its own, but with no communication, it began to feel overwhelming. Ben, his frustration mounting, stopped for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to calm his racing thoughts. That's when he remembered Jack's words, *focus on your breathing, stay present. Slowly, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to slow down. He looked around, really looked, noticing the subtle signs in the forest, the direction of the wind, the way the moss grew on the trees, and the faint sound of running water in the distance. It clicked. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly, he was learning to read the land. With renewed focus, he moved toward the sound of the water, knowing that he was on the right track. It wasn't long before the rest of the kids made their way to the stream as well, each one a little more confident than before. When they finally met up at the water source, Jack was waiting for them, a small smile on his face. "You did well," he said, his voice calm and steady as always. "You stayed focused, even when things weren't going the way you expected. That's what it takes to survive. It's not always about strength or speed. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to slow down, when to breathe, and when to trust your instincts." The kids, exhausted but proud, nodded. They had learned something that couldn't be taught in a classroom. They had learned how to stay calm under pressure, how to adapt, and most importantly, how to trust themselves when everything seemed uncertain. As the sun set, they headed back to the yard, no longer the same kids who had once mocked the idea of survival skills. Now, they were survivors in their own right, ready for whatever came next. The weeks had passed, and the kids were becoming more skilled, more self-reliant. Their confidence grew with each lesson they learned from Jack Miller, and today, Jack had something new in store for them. The air was cool, a crisp breeze sweeping through the trees as they gathered around Jack in the yard. "Today, we're going to talk about teamwork," Jack said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of seriousness. "Out there, you're not going to survive alone. You'll need to work with others, rely on each other. And you'll need to trust that your team can handle the same challenges you do." The kids stood still, listening intently. They had always done things on their own, relying on their individual skills, but they knew Jack's lessons always had a deeper meaning. "We're going to split into teams," Jack continued. "Each of you will face a challenge, and you'll have to work together to solve it. This isn't about being the fastest or the strongest. It's about working as one, understanding each other's strengths, and covering each other's weaknesses." The kids exchanged glances, their faces uncertain but determined. Ben stepped forward, a new confidence in his stride. "What's the first challenge?" he asked, ready to take on whatever Jack had in mind. Jack smiled, pleased with the change in the kids. "The first challenge is simple. You'll build a shelter together, but here's the twist. One of you will be blindfolded, one will have their hands tied, and one will be forced to carry a heavy load." The kids stared at Jack, their expressions ranging from confusion to apprehension. "You're going to have to work with what you've got," Jack said. "The blindfolded person won't be able to see, the one with tied hands won't be able to use them, and the one with the load will have to keep moving despite the weight. You'll have to rely on each other, guide each other, and communicate. You won't survive if you don't." Ben looked at his friends, his eyes narrowing with understanding. "Okay, we can do this," he said, his voice firm. They quickly broke into teams, and Jack gave the signal to start. The first challenge was tough. Ben was the one with the blindfold, unable to see anything around him. His friend Max had his hands tied, struggling to hold anything steady. Meanwhile, Olivia had a heavy pack strapped to her back, weighing her down. They fumbled through the first steps, trying to gather materials for the shelter, each person trying to do their part but feeling the weight of the challenge. But slowly, they began to adapt. Max, despite his tied hands, became the organizer, directing Olivia to carry materials in a way that balanced the load better. Ben, though blindfolded, used his other senses to feel his way around, listening to Max's instructions and feeling for the right places to tie knots and secure the structure. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of frustration. But little by little, they built something together. As the shelter began to take shape, the kids realized they were not just working together, they were understanding each other in a way they hadn't before. The challenge had taught them something deeper than just survival skills. They had learned the importance of communication, trust, and patience. When the shelter was finally complete, Jack stood back and watched them, a proud smile on his face. "You did it," he said, his voice full of approval. "It wasn't perfect, but you worked together, and that's what matters." Out there, it's never about being alone. It's about making sure your team has your back and that you have theirs. The kids looked at their shelter, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and pride. They had faced something difficult and come out stronger for it. Ben turned to Jack, his voice full of gratitude. "Thanks, Mr. Miller. We didn't think we could do it, but we did. Together." Jack nodded, his eyes softening. "You're learning. You're getting there. Just remember, the real test comes when you're out there and the stakes are high. But if you can trust each other, you'll be ready for anything." The days grew warmer, and Jack noticed a change in the kids. They were no longer just learning, they were beginning to think like survivors. They were starting to anticipate the next lesson before he even had to teach it. But Jack knew there was still much to learn, and this time, he was going to push them harder. He stood in front of the group, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "This week," Jack began, "you're going to face a real test. It's time for you to put everything you've learned into practice. You've learned how to build shelters, find water, and navigate, but now you're going to survive for 24 hours in the woods. Alone." The kids looked at each other, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. Ben, now more confident than ever, stepped forward. "Alone?" he asked, his voice steady but a hint of uncertainty in his tone. Jack nodded. "That's right. No one's going to be there to help you. You'll be on your own. You'll need to make your own shelter, find food, and keep your mind sharp. If you can handle it, you'll prove you're ready for anything." The challenge was set. Jack handed them each a small pack with a few basic supplies, nothing that would make the task too easy. They had to rely on their own skills, their wits, and what they had learned. "You'll be back here tomorrow, at the same time," Jack said. "Until then, you're on your own." Ben's heart raced, but there was no turning back. He looked at his friends, all of them preparing for the night ahead. He could see the same nervousness in their eyes, but also something else, determination. Jack's lessons had taken root, and now they had to prove to themselves they could survive. As the group scattered into the woods, each of them heading in different directions, Ben's thoughts raced. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the forest. He found a small clearing and began to set up his shelter, using the skills Jack had taught him. The work was hard, but Ben didn't mind. He focused on every detail, making sure his shelter was secure. As the darkness settled in, Ben realized how quiet it was. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant bird call. He felt a sense of isolation, but it wasn't the kind of loneliness he had expected. It was a feeling of being connected to the world around him, a feeling that Jack had tried to instill in them all along. As the night grew colder, Ben made a small fire, just as Jack had shown him. He sat close to it, warming his hands, and thought about what he had learned. He had learned to rely on his instincts, to trust his abilities, and most importantly, to stay calm in the face of adversity. The fire crackled softly, and Ben allowed himself a small smile. He had faced the challenge, and he knew he was ready. In the distance, he could hear the others. They were facing their own challenges, and Ben knew they would be stronger for it. The night was long, but as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had done it. He had survived the night alone, just as Jack had promised. And when he met up with the others the next morning, he saw the same look in their eyes, the look of people who had learned something real, something important. They weren't just kids anymore. They were survivors. And it was Jack who had shown them how to be ready for whatever came next. The following week, the kids gathered again, a little more confident than before. They had survived the night in the woods, and the bond between them had strengthened. As they stood in front of Jack, their eyes were filled with a new sense of purpose. Jack could see the change in them, how they no longer saw themselves as just kids, but as young survivors. "You've all done well," Jack said, his voice calm as usual. "You survived out there alone, and now you're ready for the next lesson. Today, we're going to work on something different. It's not about survival in the wild anymore. It's about what comes after. The kids looked at each other, confused. What do you mean, after? Ben asked. Jack nodded, understanding the confusion. Once you survive, the next challenge is staying alive. It's not just about making it through the night or finding food. It's about how you take care of yourself and each other when things calm down. Survival doesn't end when the immediate danger is gone. You have to keep going. Jack led them to a new part of the woods, one that they hadn't explored before. The trees were dense, and the ground was soft underfoot. This is about managing resources, Jack explained. When you're out there, it's easy to forget about the long term. You get caught up in the immediate needs, food, water, shelter. But what happens when the food runs out, or the water supply dries up? You need to think ahead. Jack handed each of them a small journal and a pencil. Today, you're going to make a plan. You'll need to think about what you'd do if you had to stay out here for an extended period. How would you manage your food, water, and energy? And more importantly, how would you keep morale high when everything feels like it's running out? The kids stared at the journals, unsure of how to start. Jack watched them for a moment before speaking again. This is about your mental strength, too. When you're out there, your mind will be just as important as your body. You need to stay sharp, focused, and positive. That's what will keep you going, even when it feels impossible. Ben flipped open his journal, staring at the blank page. It seemed like a simple exercise, but he realized Jack was teaching them something deeper than survival skills. This was about resilience. This was about the fight to keep going when everything else was telling them to stop. As the kids worked through their plans, Jack walked around, offering guidance where needed. He wasn't telling them what to write, he was making them think for themselves. After a while, they all gathered again, their journals filled with ideas and strategies. Jack nodded in approval. You've done well. You've all thought about what it would take to survive long term. Now, remember that mindset. When you're facing tough times, whether it's in the wild or in life, you need to keep a plan in mind and stay positive. That's how you'll keep moving forward. The kids nodded, understanding the weight of his words. They had learned that survival wasn't just about the immediate dangers. It was about maintaining strength, both physically and mentally, for as long as it took. They had learned the importance of preparing not just for what they could see, but for what might come next. And with that knowledge, they felt more ready than ever for whatever challenge Jack might throw at them next. The next morning, the kids gathered as usual, their faces filled with excitement and anticipation. Jack had promised that this day would be different, it would be the culmination of everything they had learned so far. As they stood in front of him, Jack's usual calm demeanor gave way to a subtle intensity. Today, Jack began, you'll be facing your final challenge. You've learned how to survive on your own, how to work as a team, and how to think ahead. But now, you're going to learn what it means to push past your limits, to dig deep when you think you can't go any further. The kids exchanged looks, their nerves starting to surface. You've all proven you can survive out there, Jack continued, but survival isn't always about the skills you have. Sometimes, it's about mental toughness, the ability to keep going when everything seems impossible. The group was silent, taking in Jack's words. This is about resilience, he said. It's about perseverance, about finding that extra bit of strength when you think you have nothing left. Ben, who had grown more confident over the weeks, stepped forward. What's the challenge, Mr. Miller? He asked, his voice steady. Jack smiled slightly. You'll spend the next 48 hours out there, he said, pointing toward the forest. But this time, it's different. You're going to face obstacles, tests that will push you beyond what you think you're capable of. The kids stood still, absorbing the gravity of what Jack was saying. You'll need to use everything you've learned, your skills, your teamwork, and most importantly, your resilience, Jack said. When you think you've reached your limit, that's when the real test begins. Without another word, Jack handed them each a pack with the basics they'd need. I'll be checking in on you, he said. But remember, you're on your own. This is about you learning to push past your doubts and fears. The kids headed into the forest, their steps hesitant at first, but each one determined to succeed. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they faced challenges, unpredictable weather, tricky terrain, and even a few minor setbacks, like a broken tent pole and the sudden disappearance of their water source. But instead of panicking, they worked together, using the skills they had learned from Jack. They improvised, adapted, and supported each other. Ben, who had once been uncertain about his ability to lead, found himself taking charge when things went wrong. He encouraged the others, reminded them of what they'd learned, and pushed them to keep going. There were moments when doubt crept in, moments when it seemed easier to give up. But each time, Jack's words echoed in their minds, it's about mental toughness. Push past your limits. The first night in the woods was the hardest. They sat around a small fire, exhausted and hungry, their bodies aching from the day's trials. But there was a sense of accomplishment in the air, a feeling that they had made it through. Ben looked around at his friends, each of them silently reflecting on the journey they had been on. We can do this, he said softly, his voice more confident than before. The others nodded, knowing he was right. As the hours passed, the kids drifted off to sleep, each of them still carrying the weight of the challenge, but also the knowledge that they had learned to rely on each other. When the morning sun rose, they had completed the first half of the challenge. They were tired, but their spirits were high. They had pushed past their limits and learned that resilience wasn't just about surviving, it was about knowing you can keep going, even when you think you can't. And as they gathered their things to head back to Jack, they knew that this challenge, more than any other, had prepared them for whatever came next. Jack was waiting for them when they returned. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a spark of approval. Well done, he said, his voice calm and steady as always. You've proven that you can handle anything that comes your way. And more importantly, you've learned the most important lesson of all, that survival is about more than just getting through, it's about growing, adapting, and never giving up. The kids stood in silence, each of them absorbing the weight of Jack's words. They had been tested, and they had passed. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were stronger, more resilient, and ready for whatever the world had in store. Weeks had passed since the final challenge, and the kids had transformed in ways they couldn't have imagined when they first met Jack. They were no longer the same kids who had laughed at the idea of survival skills or thought they knew everything. They had learned to adapt, to rely on each other, and, most importantly, to trust themselves. Jack, standing in front of them one morning, saw the change in their eyes. He knew they were ready for the next step. You've learned how to survive, how to work together, how to think ahead, Jack said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet pride. But now, it's time to move beyond just survival. It's time to live. The kid stood still, processing his words. Ben, who had become the unofficial leader of the group, spoke up. What do you mean, Mr. Miller? Jack smiled, his eyes sharp as ever. Living is more than just getting by. It's about thriving. It's about understanding your purpose and using everything you've learned to make a difference. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. I've taught you how to survive in the wild, how to work together when things get tough, and how to push past your limits. But now, I want you to think about how you can use those lessons in the world around you. Survival isn't just for the woods. It's for life. The kids exchanged glances, unsure of what Jack meant, but the weight of his words was clear. They had always seen survival as something isolated, something they did when they were in danger. But now, they realized, it was a mindset they could carry with them everywhere. What you're going to do now, Jack continued, is take everything you've learned and put it to use. In your community, in your schools, in your families, be the people who make a difference. Show others how to survive, how to adapt, and how to keep going when it feels like everything is falling apart. Ben took a deep breath. You mean, we're going to teach others? Jack nodded. Exactly. You've learned the hard way. Now it's time to share that knowledge. Help others understand that survival isn't just about physical strength, it's about mental strength, adaptability, and resilience. The kids looked at each other, excitement beginning to replace the uncertainty they had felt earlier. They had grown in ways they never expected, and now they realized they could use what they had learned to inspire others. Start with small things, Jack added, but make sure you're always helping others see their own potential. Make sure they understand that they're stronger than they think. That's how we change the world, one person at a time. Ben, now feeling a renewed sense of purpose, turned to his friends. "We've got this," he said with a grin. The others nodded, their faces full of determination. They had been through so much together, and now, they were ready to help others do the same. As they walked away from Jack, heading toward their homes, they felt a new sense of responsibility. They weren't just survivors anymore, they were leaders, ready to show others what it meant to thrive. Jack watched them go, a proud smile on his face. He had taught them the most important lesson of all, that survival was just the beginning. True living came from sharing, teaching, and helping others find their strength. He had given them the tools, and now, they were ready to change the world.